We are farmers.
The beauty of clay is that you can reuse it. So once they were finished with that project, you'd strip the clay off the model, you throw it back in the clay bin, and then you'd reuse it all over again. So clay models couldn't last because clay as a property is not very stable. It's very climate controlled. If it's hot out, the clay just turns into mush, it melts. If it's cold out, the clay gets real hard and brittle and it cracks. So you can't save a clay model. Back in the old days, clay was made out of a combination of whale oil and sulfur and a bunch of things like that. Well, obviously today, you can't use whale oil for anything like that. So the composition of clay today is a paraffin base, a waxed base, and if you try to attach a paraffin-based clay to the old whale clay, they just won't adhere right to one another. And so I said, we don't have that old clay anymore, number one. And number two, the clay is so old and brittle and cracked that if I took it out of there, the whole thing is just going to crumble. So I have a lot of old photographs that I snuck. You know, when I worked at White Motors, you know, we would do truck projects, and you know, there was always a Polaroid laying around, so I'd snap a couple of shots. So I do have some of that stuff, but it's just Polaroid snaps, basically. And of course, the little renderings that I did in my little notebook, I have all that kind of stuff still to amaze my grandkids with. But you know, this thing about renderings and saving them, to me, that's a very, very important thing. I'm glad people did that, because otherwise, it's gone. The history of what we've done is in a dustbin somewhere. And I've always said, I wrote a paper about this. I think if you look at the history of automobile styling and the way they render things, it's just like if you look at classical art history. There is a certain evolution of the way art, you know, like classical painting evolved throughout the centuries. It's the same thing with automobile styling from the 40s to today. You can look at a rendering that was done in the 40s and 50s and immediately know that that's where that came from. You can look at a rendering from the 60s, and I'm not talking by the content, because everybody knows what a 65 GTO wasn't done in 1940. I'm talking about the style, the way they rendered things, the materials that they used. So you can see a progression. You know, it went from in the 40s and 50s, they were a lot of airbrushing and you know, really fine, really tight controlled things. And you go into the 70s and everybody was using magic markers and like this. So you can see a progression. And for us to have lost that, to me, it's a sin, especially here in the Motor City. That stuff needs to be saved, and it needs to be, you know, it needs to have exposure. Here's a perfect example. Have you ever been down to the DIA? You have to walk in there. The main hall is a huge Diego Rivera mural that he painted on a wall back in the 30s. And it's all about working in the factories and all about the automobile industry in Detroit. If it wasn't for these renderings that these guys did to create the autos and the whatnot that they came off of those renderings, Diego Rivera never would have painted that masterpiece. That's why it's important. To me, that's why it's important. I've been waiting for a moment like this forever. You have that beautiful museum, and what she and her husband are trying to do is exactly what that museum needs, because that is a history of what went on in this town. What is going to go into that museum wing is what made that museum, what made southeastern Michigan what it is today. And it's important that it be celebrated, and it's important that it be remembered. So I think that I've been waiting for this to happen, and I have a whole wing devoted to automotive art. Detroit deserves that.